People have complained for years about the fact that our data is all over the place. That's not an issue anymore. You could let your data be all over the place. Your data could live in 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 different sources. As long as you construct and provide the right instruction of, let's just say, a prep process of where to go and pull that information from, let it live in 25 different sources. We're at a point now where you could definitely spend entire days, maybe even weeks, without really having to log into Salesforce to get things done. You're going to have to engage in some way, whether that's through Slack, through Teams, on your phone. There's going to need to be some mechanism whereby you're viewing and updating information, but there is definitely a much smaller requirement for you to have to deal with the traditional Salesforce user interface from this point forward. And I should say it's actually a lot easier for you and your organization to get to a point where that is true.
Welcome to Go-to-Market Science. In this podcast, we share tangible, actionable playbooks from the trenches, working as go-to-market strategy and RevOps consultants for our clients here at Union Square Consulting, and candid conversations with revenue leaders in the market that have been there. Now let's get into it. Awesome. Welcome to another episode of Go-to-Market Science. Today, we are going to talk about the question, do we ever need to log into Salesforce again? What Salesforce Headless 360 means for go-to-market. My guest today is Gerry Marletta, our own SVP of Delivery here at Union Square Consulting. He's been here something like 9 years? Almost the entire time this company has existed.
Yeah. The company was a year old, I think, when I started.
If that. It was almost non-existent. And previous to that, Gerry ran go-to-market operations at Argyle for 8 years. Just a really long time, growing from pretty junior to pretty senior, with a 300-person org, Gerry?
Yeah, from 20 people when I started to 300 at its max, and shrank back down at one point. But yeah, we had a pretty large team for a while.
You put those two things together, you're going on 20 years of go-to-market strategy and operations. And yet, is this the first podcast you and I have done together?
I believe so. I feel like we recorded one other at some point in time, but I don't think anything came of it. So let's call this the first official one.
Yeah. And so I'm excited to have you on the show, back again, maybe. I don't know. I can't remember. But so many of these we do with external guests, or Rachel and I do these, but this particular topic, I'm way out of my depth. And I wanted to bring you and Gerry to talk, to the extent you can. I know this is constantly evolving, about how Salesforce is enabling AI to communicate with Salesforce and what this actually means for go-to-market. Why should a CRO or a CMO care? How is this going to affect the sales job, the marketing job, the CS job, the RevOps job? How is this going to change go-to-market? And so the elevator pitch here is that Salesforce has surrendered to Claude and ChatGPT. Salesforce's co-founder, Parker Harris, literally one of the co-founders of the company, is asking the same question. Why should you ever log into Salesforce again? So Salesforce recently went headless. These two things are tandem. That's when Parker Harris asked this question at a conference, as they were announcing headless, at least as far as I remember, allowing AI tools to communicate directly with the data in Salesforce, which I'm really excited, because as much as I'm a Salesforce fanboy and have been for 20 years, I don't want to log into Salesforce. I don't want to update my opportunities. Nobody does. So we're here on this podcast to ask that very question. So Gerry, once again, thank you for taking the time to join me today. I'm excited to dive into it with you.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So let's start with this main question. Do we ever need to log into Salesforce again? And I'll start there, and I'll let you take it wherever you want, and then I'll break this question down a little bit more specific.
Yeah. In short, it depends on who you are. Depends on what your role is. Depends on what it is you're trying to do. You were at a point now where you could definitely, depending on what you do within your organization, you could spend a good chunk of your day not ever having to log into Salesforce. You could probably spend entire days, maybe even weeks, without really having to log into Salesforce to get things done. You're going to have to engage in some way, whether that's through Slack, through Teams, on your phone. But there's going to need to be some mechanism whereby you're viewing and updating information. But there is definitely a much smaller requirement for you to have to deal with the traditional Salesforce user interface from this point forward. And I should say it's actually a lot easier for you and your organization to get to a point where that is true.
And so what's the benefit here? From my perspective, I see two things. Number one, no sales rep in the history of sales reps has ever said oh, I can't wait to log in and update Salesforce. Even when I was a sales rep at Salesforce, we didn't want to log into Salesforce and update Salesforce, right? Nobody wants to do that. And then from a leadership perspective, whether you're a CRO, a CMO, RevOps, CEO, board, you're relying on data that is populated in Salesforce, previously manually by reps, increasingly with automation, and now with AI. And so from my perspective, this is really, really exciting because we can not only go to the frontline sales rep, but we can also go to the CRO and the CEO and the board and say, you will have fuller, richer data that will tell you about where you're headed as a company and what's working and not working because of this new capability. Or you could.
Yeah. You're removing a lot of the friction when you've got that sentiment from users on the team, from AEs on the team who hate logging into Salesforce, who hate clicking through things, who hate jumping through the hoops, that the operational side of the business, the RevOps, so the go-to-market ops team has decided is necessary in order to have clean and accurate information. That causes friction because that's a lot of extra things that, like you said, sales reps don't want to have to do. And then therefore they're kind of fudging it. You know, they're clicking for the sake of clicking. They're not bothering to put in as much effort, and you're relying entirely on them to begin with to make the judgment call on some of that information when you have maybe more accurate, more trustworthy sources like call recordings, like direct email exchanges that you could rely on to glean that information from. So we're now at a point where you can meet the team where they're at and have to say no and have to compromise far less often in terms of how you configure the experience for we'll use AEs, sales reps as the example here. You can say no and have to compromise far less often now than you ever had to before.
Yeah. I mean, this is something I've come full circle on because I remember my first implementation of Salesforce. I was part of a small sales team. I was doubling as like the Salesforce admin, building out Salesforce for our sales team. And I was butting heads with the senior people on that team that were saying, we refuse to log into Salesforce. Now, this was on Wall Street, different culture than B2B tech, right? But we had directors, managing directors, principals, very senior people bringing in a lot of money. For context, my firm helped raise private equity funds. And so we were like an outsourced sales team. Private equity firm would hire us. We'd go out and call in institutional investors, set up meetings, and help drive investments of multi-billion-dollar funds. And so you had reps, they wouldn't be called reps, but you had people that were bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars of business and millions of dollars of revenue for my company, saying, I'm not going to log into Salesforce. And previous to this, we didn't have Salesforce. And these guys were calling analysts and they would literally leave voicemails. And the analysts would have to update I'm going to use air quotes for CRM because it was Excel prior to this. And so I was tasked with solving this problem. And I'm being told by these senior people, we're not going to log into Salesforce, full stop, period. I fought with them and lost that fight. I soon thereafter went to Salesforce, where that was very much the culture. If you don't keep Salesforce updated, you will not have a job. If it doesn't happen in Salesforce, it doesn't count, kind of thing, which is a mantra that a lot of companies live by. But you and I have seen both sides of the spectrum, even as recently as the last couple months, where we talk to CROs on a regular basis that say, I would fire certain people on my team for refusing to update Salesforce, but then I would get fired the next day. So I can live in this utopian worldview where we fire anybody that doesn't do exactly what we want to do in Salesforce. But there's two problems with that. Number one is, how much can you get them to do? Because you and I have made this mistake where we let a customer drive us to this destination many years ago, where every time a rep got off the phone, they had to update 35 fields in Salesforce. And the result of this was like an absolute mutiny of the sales team, where all the people we worked with, and us included, all got fired. We're talking C-level people got fired over this decision, and we should have pushed back harder. And then fast forward to today, and this is still a problem. And so for me, I'm looking at this and I'm like, me personally, I don't want to log into Salesforce. I have Sarah, our executive assistant, do 99% of the updating to Salesforce, only because like we have yet to build out all the perfect AI stack to replace this. But for years and years, I have been avoiding logging into Salesforce myself while simultaneously telling our clients they need to force their reps to log into Salesforce, right? I've also said on the side, like, hey, like hire a bunch of executive assistants. They're amazing. Nobody listens to me there. But now that we have AI, I think it's an incredible opportunity to not only improve the profession of sales, but also improve go-to-market analytics and go-to-market leadership and the company as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, you're removing that friction. You're getting honest, truthful information, all aggregated in one place, or maybe in multiple places. If Salesforce is where it all needs to live, if at the deal level, at the opportunity level is where you need those facts to live. Again, the rep may just be able to key in their updates again in a Slack channel to a bot. They may be able to dictate it in, depending on the tool they're using, or again, you can pull it from those first party sources, so it doesn't have to filter through their brain. Or maybe you want that, right? I think it's important to mention here that not everything should be fully left up to an LLM to make a judgment call on all of those decisions. But it's a lot easier to run some updates past the AE to say, hey, does this all look right to you? Let me know if there's any tweaks that need to be made. And then I'll go push it into Salesforce under the opportunity for you, than it is for them to come up with that from scratch. So
absolutely. And so we're going to get into brass tacks here. I want to give folks listening to this some key takeaways. If you're a CRO listening to this and you're thinking, how can I, access, Salesforce Headless? How can I improve, my analytics? How can I make life easier for my sales reps? We're going to get into that. If you're the person that's actually trying to build this stuff out, we're going to share some intel here. Now, obviously, like the devil's in the details, and we're not going to get into like complex workflows, but at a high level, we're going to touch on that. And so if you're listening to this, stay tuned. I want to get into some specifics that you can take away and take action on. But I want to start by setting a foundational understanding for anybody listening to this, in case you didn't have this, because this is something I didn't have. When I hear Salesforce Headless 360, my first question is, what the heck is Salesforce Headless? So let's start with that, Gerry, and then we'll kind of peel the onion back, so that people listening to this can have like a foundational understanding of what this is and what's possible. So what is Headless 360?
Sure. So Headless 360 is really just a label for a concept of how to approach, systems interacting with Salesforce and the people then also interacting with Salesforce. As anybody who's listening may know, Salesforce has had an API available basically since day one. And that API is let's just say it's a dictionary of how one machine can talk to the Salesforce machine, how a third-party tool, something that you buy off the shelf or something that you may create on your own, can interact with Salesforce. However, that API needs to be understood and needs to be known by the developer, let's say, who's building that connection to Salesforce to do some of that automatic writing to and reading from Salesforce. So that's nothing that's new at all for Salesforce. What makes the sort of Headless 360 truly headless is the rollout of the Salesforce MCP. So the MCP, that's the Model Context Protocol. What that is a MCP is like a standard. It's a standard way for all of the AI and LLM tools that are out there, whether it's Claude, whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's Gemini, whether it's something you're building on your own, to understand basically instantaneously how it can translate things that the end user, like myself using Claude, asking questions, how it can translate that into a language that Salesforce would understand without Claude having to understand Salesforce's API in depth. So Salesforce publishes this, and the MCP is a combination of resources, and it allows me to write a quick prompt in Claude. Hey, tell me about my open pipeline. And that MCP is what enables Claude to very quickly know it needs to look at opportunities, let's say, and it needs to look at opportunities where it's one of the open stages, for example. So that's really the big sort of radical shift. That's the element that's made this announcement relevant and available.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful. And one other thing that I think is really interesting is the ability for an MCP to help prevent hallucinations by giving you the raw data, right? Now we're going to get into that. And I think that this is really important because, again, I'm trying to frame this conversation to be a little technical, but not too technical. If a CRO or a CMO is listening to this and they're thinking, why should I care about this? What can I do with this? I want to answer that question here in this podcast. And at the same time, provide like a high level guidance if they want to hand that off to somebody else in their organization to say, like, let's go run with this. Of course, you guys can always call us and talk to Gerry and hire us for your help. But the point of this podcast is to try to put out content that you can take action on yourself if you don't want to do that. And well, the way that I think about this is like, first and foremost, we need to be able to trust our data, right? I literally just saw a video over at Data Rails put together an AI video, and it was hilarious. I saw this right while I was prepping for the call. And in the AI video, you have like a CFO of like a big company prepping the board deck, and he's in Claude and he's just asking Claude to just prep the board deck. And then of course, like all the numbers are wrong and he loses his job, and then he becomes homeless and he's like fighting raccoons on the street. And, it's just supposed to be funny, but like it touches on a really important point. Like, well, would you trust Claude to do your data analytics in a board meeting? And the short answer is no. You need to verify this data. But it's one end of the spectrum to say, like, let me just go into Claude and ask a bunch of questions and have it prepare my board deck for me. And then I'm going to show up in a board meeting and say a bunch of things that I can't rely on. And it's another thing to say, well, I'm going to start in Salesforce and I'm going to build out all these custom reports in Salesforce, and Salesforce reporting has limitations, instead of trying to give myself a leg up. And we're only talking about analytics. There are many other use cases here, right? There's sales reps prepping for calls, figuring out who they should call. There's marketing, like trying to build out, contact lists and things like that they want to maybe do targeted ads to. There's all kinds of use cases here. And so my first question is like, Gerry, how do you think about getting quality data out of the system? Let's start with kind of the easy one. How important is it to have a clean Salesforce and clean architecture for this? If we have a bunch of custom objects and a bunch of custom fields, and we have redundant fields, and the data is like an absolute mess. When we were prepping for this call, you talked about like having descriptions for fields, things like this. If we try to just plug the MCP into Claude and start asking questions, what are we going to get if our Salesforce architecture is an absolute mess?
Well, you're not going to get hallucinations necessarily, and that's a word that often gets thrown around when it comes to LLMs. It's not so much that you're going to have hallucinated information where Claude, we'll just stick with Claude here, is making things up. Instead, what you're going to run into is scenarios where Claude doesn't necessarily understand the ins and outs. It doesn't have the institutional knowledge that your own in-house Salesforce admin may have to understand that. We'll just stick with the example you were saying of fields with descriptions. If I log into a Salesforce org today and I take a look at an open opportunity, I might be presented with 20 or 30 fields. And hopefully those fields are somewhat clearly labeled, and I might be able to quickly get up to speed and understand how a sales process is run for that team. When you're utilizing Claude and you're utilizing an MCP, it doesn't see Salesforce that way. Whether you're using the API or an MCP, I should say. But regardless, it's not seeing things the way a human user sitting in front of Salesforce does. So that's where one of the first kind of risks you would run into is going to be that there is kind of a self-imposed set of guardrails put in place by only showing so many fields to the user. So without giving Claude any additional context or any additional instructions or guidance, what you're likely to run into is every time you go through this exercise of prepping that board deck, you're going to have to repeat yourself, and you're going to have to correct it to say, look, don't use this field you're looking at called, let's say you're dealing with recurring revenue. Don't use that MRR field. Use this other ARR field instead. Well, how would Claude know that? How would Claude know that the standard amount field isn't really relevant for some of the metrics you're trying to put together? It doesn't, because all of those fields available on your opportunity are essentially created equal as far as it's concerned. It needs to basically give the same amount of weight and the same amount of importance to all of them as it's trying to figure out what you're asking it. Again, if you are a new sales rep to the organization, you go in and you look at an open opportunity and you just see one field on screen with a dollar value in it, you can probably pretty safely assume that's the important one. That's the one I need to think about when I'm thinking about my pipeline value. So, that's kind of the first big thing to consider is the cleaner from a build perspective, from a configuration perspective that your Salesforce org is, the less correcting, the less guardrails and less rules you would have to put in place.
Let's say that Salesforce is an absolute hot mess, right? And we're not exaggerating here. We've seen so many instances. As you said, 30 fields. How about 300? Okay. And many of them are redundant, and some of those fields haven't been there in a long time. And let's say that they're not on the page layout. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but I'm assuming that Claude wouldn't even necessarily know that it's on a page layout or not.
It wouldn't have any idea. You could, that's maybe one angle. You could try to provide some guidance is say, because it can see that configuration. There are, the way the page is configured lives in code somewhere. So you might instruct it to only look at fields that are on a page layout, but even that's not necessarily good enough. So I think the question you're asking is, well, what do you do in that scenario where you've got 300 fields and most of them are legacy and outdated and not relevant? Well, now you've got a compromise, or you've got a situation on your hands where you need to determine, am I going to rely on Claude to prep this board deck that's due in a half an hour? Or am I going to just have to do it the old fashioned way and invest some time after this to document things a little bit better? So you don't necessarily need to go in and consider this massive initiative to clean up your instance of Salesforce just so that you can use an LLM or a tool similar to that to build that board deck going forward. But you probably need to think about having some instructions somewhere to guide it. These are the 1 or 2 or 3 key fields. When I ask for, value, or you look at these fields, include opportunities owned by these reps. And they're the reps that have a role of, sales rep versus the ones that have a role of a CS rep or something. You need to put some thought in. The way I think about it is pretend you just hired an incredibly intelligent, but fresh out of college. I don't want to say intern because you hired them, but somebody who's really new to all of this, and they have no context, but they can see it all. And given the right guardrails is a term I keep using. Given the right guardrails and the right set of instructions that you could refine over time, they, or in this case, Claude, can churn out some really powerful information for you very, very quickly. But if you just set them free, again, they have no context awareness. They have no institutional knowledge. They're going to make guesses at things, and they're going to err on the side of appeasing you. I think that's probably one thing that's really important to also consider when you're dealing with any of these AI tools is they want to give you a positive answer sort of natively. Unless you provide other direct instruction, they want to be yes men or yes people. So you have to be really cautious about that.
This is exactly where I was going with this. And I want to bring this back up high level because I want to try to thread the needle between getting in the weeds and being high level. And I want to talk about actual use cases, right? And so, Gerry, feel free to correct me, but I'm just going to sort of think out loud here about how I would solve for this and why. Let's say that I want to build something that enables my reps to do better account research, or let's say like update the opportunities in Salesforce, right? So let's just say that let's just combine these two things and say that I want to prep for calls with, folks that are in our pipeline, and I want to update our pipeline. So the first thing I'm thinking is that we need that context and those instructions. And so what I would want to do is I'd want to go and let's say that I'm new to the organization. I don't know anything. I'd want to go in and look through the opportunities and figure out which fields are relevant. How do we interpret those fields? How does Claude understand what those fields are if they don't have the description field, et cetera, for the purpose that we're trying to achieve here, which is we want to give our reps the information they need to get on their next call with opportunities that we have in the pipeline. And the reason that I'm trying to get really specific here is there's nothing I hate more than this idea that, we as Salesforce professionals are going to go in and clean up every object and every workflow and everything. And for what? Like, hey, Mr. or Ms. CRO, give me $100,000 or $1 million as an employee, a team of employees, a consultant, what have you. And your benefit is that you're going to get a nice, clean Salesforce. Why do we want a clean Salesforce? Well, we want to drive outcomes. So I don't want a clean Salesforce. I couldn't care if Salesforce is like the biggest dumpster fire ever. And I say this having worked at Salesforce, where aspects of Salesforce were a dumpster fire. But the reason they were a dumpster fire is because the organization said our priorities are to drive revenue and forecast accurately, and these aspects of Salesforce being a dumpster fire don't prevent us from doing that. So that's not where we're going to invest our resources. We're going to invest our resources in driving outcomes. And so if we want to have really clean pipeline management, Tell me if I'm wrong here. What I'm thinking here is that we need to go through and understand how opportunities in Salesforce work, as well as the related objects like accounts, contacts, activities, etc. And we need to provide the context and instructions to Claude so that it can go through the MCP and know what fields to look for, how to interpret those fields, and how to give us the information that we want. Alongside the instructions to say, for example, give me like a call prep or an account research document. This is how you would do this. This is the fields you would look at. And oh, by the way, possibly using other systems. We can go, do a web search. We can tap into Zoom Info or Clay via their MCP. We can do a lot of different things to then feed that rep the information that they need to get on their next call.
Yeah, and I know we don't want to like dive deep into like prompt engineering here, but another layer you would add to that also is every day or every hour, depending on how frequently your reps' calendars may shift, have Claude go and take a look at all the invites on their calendar for the day, all the events on the calendar for the day. Look at the domains of the people on the invites and look at the subject line, and prep those prep sheets ahead of time, rather than the AE having to remember to pull that, because there's nothing worse than being in back-to-back calls and 2 minutes before the call realizing, crap, I didn't prep for this. You can have a scheduled task that goes and preps that for you and can infer who the customer is that it needs to do the prep for without you even having to lay your hands on the keyboard. So you can take these things even a step further and remove the human without there being any detrimental effect. I will say, I'm overly, we've talked about this before. I'm much more cautious in some ways than you are when it comes to some of these builds, especially as we've done some experiments internally. But when we're talking about reading information and not writing it, you can take the training wheels off a little bit more quickly. We're talking about writing to the database. You want to be a little more careful and provide a lot more guidance to begin with. I think that sort of answered your question or followed up on your statement, right? But
well, I think that there's two different things here. So you're talking about automating the account prep, and I totally agree with you. I mean, this is something I've been doing for years with Sarah, our executive assistant, where every morning I pop in, I have a single sheet of paper and it says, this is what I'm doing for the day. She's been preparing that for years. And then there's a link to the document for each and every call, including this call. And then it says, like, here's everything that you need to know. And for years, I've been walking into phone calls, especially sales calls, because we have it so dialed in, where my prep is less than 5 minutes. And these are important calls. I'm talking to executives in large companies, about the potential to work with us and pay us hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we've got this dialed into a point where I know exactly what I need to talk about. I've got everything in one place. And whereas previously, like even when I was working at Salesforce and we had all this data at our fingertips, I was spending half an hour prepping for a call for a much smaller deal. And so I think this is monumental. And the only gap between what we've been doing with Sarah and AI is just building this. But the concept is there.
Just making the connections. And people have complained for years about the fact that our data is all over the place. That's not an issue anymore. You could let your data be all over the place. Your data could live in 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 different sources. As long as you construct and provide the right instruction of, let's just say a prep process of where to go and pull that information from, let it live in 25 different sources. It may not be the most efficient utilization of your tokens with your tool, but that's okay. That's no longer a challenge. It's no longer an issue for this process.
Quick pause. Everything we talk about on this show, diagnosing go-to-market ops, prioritizing projects for revenue impact, processes, metrics, insights, building a predictable go-to-market engine, we've built frameworks for all of it. They're free and ungated on our website, unionsquareconsulting.com/frameworks. The link will also be in the show notes, so make sure you check that out. All right, back to the episode.
I think this is another big issue because when I left Salesforce, I was effectively the VP of RevOps at a fintech startup. I want to say small, but they were very heavily funded. And what we were doing is we had an app where Wall Street traders could trade securities in basically a hidden room so that they could not reveal the other person they were dealing with. Because if you're selling like $20 million of credit, you don't want people to know that you're doing that because that could affect the price that somebody would pay for it. Which is not good. And so on the one hand, our Salesforce was really dialed in even before I went there. And we had all of our accounts and contacts and everybody dialed in. On the other hand, we had this mountain of data from the usage in the app where like the people, like our main goal, like I worked there sort of at launch, our number one priority was getting people literally into these rooms in our app so that they could trade hundreds of millions of dollars of securities in a day. And all our sales team did all day long was like jump into Bloomberg Instant Messenger, because that was the communication medium that was working with our clients and messaging them to try to get them to go into these rooms. On the one hand, we had like a pretty small data set in Salesforce. And on the other hand, we had this massive data set of every single like room entrance and indication of interest and actual trade that was going on. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of rows of data every single day, even as we were just launching our product. And I made this mistake of saying like, well, everything should be in Salesforce. Salesforce is our single source of truth. And then trying to push all this data in Salesforce. And then for what? Like, the reps were moving too fast to access this data. I mean, this stuff was happening in real time, right? And so like we had some other dashboards outside of Salesforce, but it just felt like one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made in RevOps was like buying into this idea that we had to have all the data in one place, and like for what reason? And Salesforce is not like a really great place to store large sets of data. And, the only reason to have it in Salesforce is like if you're like looking at an account or a contact and you're prepping for a call and you have relevant information sitting there that you're going to like use to prepare for your call, that makes perfect sense. But having these large data sets doesn't. And now, instead of doing this massive integration project, you could just say, well, why don't we just toggle 2, 3, 4 different systems with AI? Because it's possibly even easier to do that than to centralize this data into one system. Even ignoring like the implementation work, just for the rep to be able to go into Slack or Claude or whatever the tool they want to use as their interface and just say like, tell me what's going on with this customer. You've provided instructions, and it's like, cool, like let's go check Salesforce, let's go check HubSpot, let's go check the website, let's go check this and that and the other, let's go check Clay. We can check all these sources at once simultaneously and provide them with the information they need at their fingertips lightning fast in comparison to what we could a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and it's the inventory on demand piece of that too. You don't have to have gathered all that information from those sources ahead of time so that it's there when you are trying to do your call prep. You get it when you need it.
Yeah. And I think that that's really exciting. So let's talk about updating Salesforce, right? So you and I have been talking to like literally every vendor under the sun that does some form of call recording and potentially updating Salesforce with that call recording. And I'm hesitant to like name names yet, but there's one or two players that we're really excited about. And this idea that AI can just listen to my call transcript, not to mention the fact that we can like integrate emails and update the Salesforce record and tell me who I met with, what we talked about, what the decision-making criteria is, medic fields, things like that, to not only inform the rep, but also leadership, co-sellers, SEs, et cetera, on what's going on with a deal, improve our forecast accuracy, et cetera, et cetera. This is really exciting to me, and I think you're going to agree with me here, like there's a limitation to this. I personally would not want a rep having AI move a deal through the funnel. I would want them to make the ultimate decision as to this is where this deal is. This is in stage 2, stage 3. This is in pipeline, out of pipeline. I'm forecasting this as such. Maybe update the next steps or validate the next steps manually, etc. But like populating like what the decision maker said or what they said about the decision making criteria into a field like decision making criteria on the opportunity does two things. One, it is a massive time savings to the rep. Actually, it's three things. It prepares them for the next call so much better. And then thirdly, it provides management a level of visibility that I think no amount of threatening to fire people will ever provide you.
I mean, you're right. Yeah. In terms of the next call prep, sure. If you don't like putting in your notes from the last call to begin with, well, now you're entirely relying on your own memory to prep for the next call for that element, because no amount of an exec assistant is going to be able to pull that up unless they were on the call and you had the recording and they're reading through it. So yeah, if you can get the notes from the call that just occurred or the exchange, whatever it was, in a system to be read by something else in advance of the next one, yeah, you're set yourself up for success there. In terms of updating the deal through the pipeline, I'm going to agree with you broadly, but I'm actually going to say it might depend on your sales motion and your sales process. Without getting in the weeds, depending on what your stages are and depending on how you sort of gate those, There may be certain stages that could be automated, but there's others that certainly shouldn't. I think 99.9% of the time would say never let that thing move it to a win or a loss. That ultimately is a human judgment call. But depending on what, of course, I'm not going to be able to come up with a good example right now.
Wait, no, that one's interesting. I want to test you on that. I would argue with you on that one. Like if the DocuSign is signed, is that not a win?
Okay, that's fair. No, you're right. A DocuSign. I'm talking about from something conversational. Let's say in a call or in an email.
Sure.
In that regard, I would not let it. No, I mean we've been letting contract signature close one opportunities for years now. That's been a first piece of automation we roll in with a DocuSign implementation. Let's say. But losses, those absolutely need to be a human judgment call for 1,000 different reasons. And wins for any other reason, shouldn't be. But there's probably some scenarios where there might be your stage 4 to your stage 5 or your stage 1 to 2. Maybe you could, depending on what your sales motion looks like, depending on the size of the product and the size of the customer and the prospect. There might be some scenarios where you could do that.
I think that's an important point. If you just look at our own sales process and what Salesforce looks like. I mean, we don't use leads really, or at least I don't know if we use leads. You might have built some automation in there that I'm not aware of, but I never look at leads for one reason, just because I think it's really important to multi-thread accounts. And so we have a stage where, and we also have a lot of partner opportunities. So we have a stage where it's stage 0. Many companies have this. It's not qualified. And for us, it's so 0, 0, 0. It's for me, our first stage means that we haven't even set a meeting yet. And then the next stage is that we actually set a meeting. And then both of those go before qualified, where qualified is we've had a meeting and there's something real there. And so you could, and not even with AI, but you could just automate and say well, once the meeting is set or once the meeting is held, it's going to be moved into these stages. And then I think that lead takes away some ambiguity so that the reps can spend more time thinking about how to close deals and how to source more deals rather than having to get into the minutia of which of these deals have I met with and which one needs to go from this stage to that stage.
The beauty of the ability to leverage AI alongside Salesforce, the ability to leverage AI in general nowadays with all of this, is the elimination of having to say no or to compromise. And so I think for somebody who's listening to this conversation, and I myself, just from reading other pieces of content that are out there, it's funny because you can say, yes, we can do that so much more and still account for every unique scenario from one customer's process to the next, or from one team's way of doing things internally, within your own org to the next. That this doesn't have to be a one size fits all. And at this point, it's maybe a bit extreme to say, but anyone who's offering a product who is trying to sell something that is, how do I want to say this? Who's trying to appeal to everybody is inevitably going to have to put some restrictions in what can be done. Whereas with a little bit of know-how and a little bit of time and effort, and relying on what others have successfully done like ourselves, you can go and roll your own way of doing these things, and it's going to do it right, and your business doesn't compromise for it. I mean, just the whole saying no to customers, because we've been dealing primarily with Salesforce over the last 10 years here. You know this, I've shared this with you. We often have to say, we can't do it quite like that. We can't build you a report quite like that. Or we have to buy another tool that gives us the ability to do those things. This eliminates all of that. You truly can customize to your own unique scenario, as long as you do it intelligently and smartly, and know that there are some risks. And so you want to make sure you're putting guardrails and protections in place. It's more often than not, somebody in an operations role can say yes to leadership to find ways to use these tools to be more efficient without, in some cases, having to buy something off the shelf. The couple of vendors you're talking about that we're really excited about, it's funny if you think about it. One of them can write updates to Salesforce around medic fields, but only their medic fields, only the ones that come with their package that you install. If you've been using medic for the last, I don't know, however long, 10 years within your business, and you've got your own fields to capture those data points, you're up a creek. You've got to move everything over into their fields and rebuild all of your reports. So that's not good. It seems like a really good thing. Oh, this tool can update my medic fields after every conversation. Well, yeah, now your admin team's got a lot of rebuilding to do.
I think that that's a really, really important point, because like whether we're like inputting information or we're extracting information, what we're ultimately trying to do as a go-to-market team is to meet our customers where they're at. And we're trying to provide the unique experience that they want that will result in the right people in the right organizations buying from us, right? Like I always try to strike this balance where, you know, there's this concept of the customer is always right. And I'm like, no, that's not true. Like if you have somebody that is going to end up becoming a net negative customer for you because they won't pay you enough money, or they're just going to be dissatisfied of this, that, or the other, then they're not right. But within the context of like the right customer that could potentially be good for you, we want to provide the experience that turns them into a profitable customer. Like the flip side is like, yeah, sure. Like customer is always right. I want to buy from Salesforce. I want Mark Benioff to be my personal CSM. It's like, okay, like that's not scalable, right? But I think that AI gives you such a greater ability to get closer to that point, where we can provide the unique customer experience that our customer wants, and also do that in a way that we can maintain profitability and serve that customer profitably. And when we pull that into Salesforce, I think it gives us the opportunity to get a lot more creative in the way that we think about going to, like, in the way we think about go to market, if just from a pure reporting perspective, because we have been hamstrung by Salesforce for so long to say like, well, Salesforce isn't architected this way, so we can't get this report the way we want it. We could download these 2 or 3 or 4 reports in Excel, and we could manually match it up all together if we wanted to spend all that time doing it, but it's not practical to do that on a regular basis. Now we can go build something in Claude and say, give me this custom report that's virtually impossible to build in Salesforce. Possibly give me this custom report that's not only impossible to build in Salesforce, but also pulls data from these 3 other sources that I don't want to build an integration for. And give me this information in real time, either like on an automated schedule or whenever I request it, or both. And now I've got this visibility that I can get in a unique way. And I'll share with you a very concrete example. I've been doing sales for like, I don't know, 25 years or something like that. And when I ran into Sales Loft and Outreach, my first reaction was, this is amazing. I tried to build something like this for myself years ago. And obviously this is a much more robust product, but then I've failed to use it. We've had Sales Loft and Outreach for years. They're kind enough to give us some free licenses. And I've tried to use it again and again, but what I get stuck in is that I'm sitting in this rigid flow, and it tells me I need to send this email to this person. But then I realize that like, oh, we know this other person. I could ask this other person for an introduction, or I didn't think that they're like actually like on Twitter, and I could just jump into Twitter and comment on their tweet. And then I want to remind myself in 2 days to follow up, or maybe tomorrow, or maybe in 3 hours to see if they responded to that tweet. Or I know that they're going to go to this conference, and I should go reach out to them and see if they want to like, or maybe they're in Pavilion and I could jump into the Pavilion Slack. And there's a million things that are these like creative ways that I've thought about trying to go after this customer, and it inhibits me from using Sales Loft or Outreach. And I end up just back in old school Salesforce with this list of people because I'm saying, I just need to know who to reach out to. And then I might get creative with how I'm going to reach out. Because in Outreach, it's 17 different clicks for me to like add the task to do the thing. And it just becomes prohibitive.
An LLM, you could set up your instructions with an LLM to say, when we're thinking about the next thing I need to do here, just remember, these are all the different avenues I have available. So if you're like me and you have a terrible memory, and it's nice to just have to think about that once. And then when it comes time for the next step, you don't have to do a bunch of those clicks, and you don't have to remember that you have 17 different methods in which you could reach out or follow up. It can even say to you, hey, Eddie, don't forget, you could leverage any of these channels. And you go, oh, that's right, I forgot I could leverage the Pavilion Slack channel as a potential avenue to follow up.
Well, and it's even more specific than that. Like the challenge I've run into is like, okay, step one, like let's jump into LinkedIn and see who comments on LinkedIn or posts on LinkedIn. Let's comment on their LinkedIn post. That's a great idea. Everybody says go do that. But then the problem is 99% of prospects aren't posting on LinkedIn. So what you end up with is a list of 200 people, and you go through 200 people to find the 2 people that actually post. That's incredibly inefficient. And then you have to go through like, now there's like 6 steps where I like comment on the post and follow up 2 days later, et cetera. And I'm just giving like a very random example, but there's many examples like this. Whereas I could just tell like Claude, like, hey, they don't post on LinkedIn, skip to like step 7, you know? And it's just really hard to do in these rigid tools. And I'm not trying to poo-poo all over Outreach and Sales Loft, but because they've built this system to be scalable across like hundreds of thousands of sales reps, they have built this system that's so rigid that you can't get creative. And I'm excited about Claude's ability to allow anybody in go-to-market, not just salespeople, but also marketing and CS, to get creative.
Yeah, and that means that you can deliver ROI to your organization, or we can deliver ROI to a customer organization so much faster. Going back to the messy org analogy, like we used to have to say, like, if your house is a mess, we can't do anything with it until we clean up the house. And it's like, well, I don't want to spend the next 6 months cleaning up things. But if you have a machine who can go in and it just knows where everything is, regardless of the clutter, on day one, we're delivering insights, versus on day 366, we can say, okay, we've cleaned up your org. We're ready to start taking a look at the data itself now and try to figure out how we can help you make better decisions.
Well, and this is a real thing that we face. So like if somebody's listening to this and they're like a VP of RevOps or even a CRO or trying to work with their head of RevOps, I think that we've probably even made this mistake in the past where there's this inclination to want to like get everything clean. And then we get this pressure from CROs, and nobody's saying this explicitly, but it's kind of like, hey, I just started this job. I'm probably going to get fired in 18 months. I don't have 6 months to sit around and clean house before I can show results. I need results yesterday. And over the course of 10 years of doing this with customer after customer, I think you get a little bit more leniency when you're like in a full-time role and maybe your boss isn't like new and they're on day one. We don't have that luxury, and we've gotten so much pressure from customers that like, we need to ship results yesterday. And for me, the lens that I've looked through with this, and feel free to like test me on this since you're the one actually like doing this work and leading our team doing this work, is like, I don't care how messy the house is. If my job is that I need to host dinner, to use a metaphor here, then all I care about is where are our guests going to go? They're going to come to the living room and the patio, and they're going to be in the kitchen. Okay, we need to clean up the living room, the patio, and the kitchen. We need to figure out what we need to do to get them in and out of the house to have this amazing dinner. If the third guest bedroom is like an absolute mess, it doesn't matter. Our job here is to put on the dinner. And so if our job here is to figure out like, how are we going to improve outbound, we need to think through the lens of, who do we need to contact? How do we prep? How do we get them the best messaging, et cetera, et cetera? And we don't need to go back in and like clean up like all the workflows and automations that don't impact that.
No, it doesn't care. The LLM machine, the AI machine doesn't care how messy it is, as long as you give it guidance. Early on, we are just as guilty, I think, as a lot of other people of using that concept of like garbage in and garbage out. And what we've learned is that doesn't have to be true. We do not have to have a perfect, structure to our database. We do not have to have perfect data in and of itself necessarily yet either. All we have to do is to take a lot of the knowledge we already have and can infer, and spend that time and energy once and iterate on improving how that tool goes and collects and does its thing. And you can even use AI and those tools to improve the quality of the data, to improve the structure of your database. So maybe I'm getting ahead of where you wanted to go with this conversation, but it's worth mentioning, rather than spending 6 months cleaning up your database, that could be scaled way down to 6 weeks instead of months. Because not only can these AI tools deal with the data itself, but the metadata, the actual structure of the databases, it can offer and even build out better ways of doing those things in a way that no one or two or team of let's say admins or developers could do in the same amount of time.
Oh yeah, I've already run like Claude Cowork to do like fuzzy deduping of like records, and you're just like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like we used to hire an outsourced company to do this, and now like maybe it's not perfect, but my God, it's pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, when we start an engagement with a customer, one of the first things we do alongside other elements of our diagnostic, just on the technical side, we're going to want to go in and see, what does your CRM structure look like? What tables you have? What are the fields? Who has permissions? All of that. And it's the process doc for that is a laborious, I should say, step-by-step thing that mostly a human has to do. It doesn't have to be that way any longer. We can now do that in 5 minutes, what used to maybe take 5 hours. And we can validate recommendations. We can review and say, actually, yeah, there's some really big wins we could make here to the structure of how things are working for you, and uncover things that are meaningful sooner rather than later. So not just in the data, but in how the way you capture the data is stored. The example we were talking about where there's 300 fields, we don't have to necessarily go through and read what each of those 300 fields are. We can get a first best guess from the machine saying, hey, it looks like 150 or so of these probably aren't even relevant because they haven't been updated by anyone in months or years.
Yeah, that's kind of the cool thing. Like, you could easily run a prompt to say, show me each field, the last time it was updated, how many of the records we have are populated. I mean, these are the things that we do as humans, like we being Union Square Consulting anyway. It's like, yeah, okay, like we've got these 300 fields on here, but 200 of them haven't been updated in like 5 years, and we have 40,000 records and they're only on like 2,000 records. Well, like, it's pretty easy for me to imagine Claude like doing that lightning fast, right? And now we have zoomed in really quickly to figure out what the context and instructions are for Claude to say, this is what you need to look for within this object or set of objects. But we're running up on time, and I want to take us home because I don't want to turn this into a 2-hour podcast. This is not the Joe Rogan experience.
But I want to keep going.
I know you do. Don't worry. We got a couple more minutes, but I want to talk about hallucinations and MCP versus SOQL queries, right? So for anybody not familiar with SOQL queries, I'm probably going to botch this explanation. It's basically just like a way to run a report in Salesforce via like a code command, like a SQL query, but it's SOQL, instead of like building out a report with the UI in Salesforce. And so this is going to be a really, really reliable way of getting data because you're literally communicating with Salesforce and you're saying, give me these objects, give me these fields, filter based on this criteria in a very, very like direct and specific way, as opposed to like Claude, like tell me like my open deals. So help me understand like what's the difference between a SOQL query and MCP, and why have you, Gerry, built our own analytics tool starting first and foremost with SOQL queries?
Yeah, absolutely. So SOQL query, like you said, is like a SQL query. It stands for Salesforce Object Query Language, or Salesforce Oriented Query Language. I probably should double check me on that. It's Salesforce's version of a very, very, very explicit statement of the information you want to extract. Like you said, there's no compromise. You're telling it the exact fields. You're telling it off of what table. You're telling it how to filter that. There's no room for interpretation unless you just wrote it wrong. And if you wrote it wrong, you're still going to get what you wrote. It's just not going to be what you expected.
Oh yeah, and this is like something I'll just touch on because like I have to teach everybody we hire this if they don't have like any Salesforce background. People always tell me like the reports are wrong. I'm like, the report's not wrong. Your filter criteria is wrong.
Right.
The reason you're not getting what you want to see is because you put the wrong filters in. It's as that simple as that.
Yeah. The error, the problem is between the chair and the keyboard. So with the MCP, the MCP is just a way for, and I need to double check this. So you might want to, don't hold me to this. It's basically helping, I'm going to stick with Claude here. It's helping Claude infer your ask and how to turn that into something like a SOQL query. But it's that inference that you get in trouble. That is the example we talked about probably at the top of this, where if you've got 7 different fields that can hold a currency amount on your opportunities, if you're not very, very crystal clear with Claude which field it is that it should be pulling to get that dollar amount, if you forget to mention, like in our use case where not every open opportunity is actually something we consider in pipeline, we don't use our stage zeros or our stage ones. There's a way to infer if it's considered actually in pipeline or not. It doesn't know those things. So it's gonna take what you said. It's gonna use the MCP to do some translation, and then it's gonna run a query that it thinks is correct. Whereas if I document the exact SOQL query, and that includes things like filter on deals that have these specific fields with these specific values, there is no chance that it's ever going to infer or guess how it should pull the data the wrong way. So the example you were sharing, some of the analytics that we run, we started with that. We started with just documenting the SOQL queries, and it lives in a set of instructions. And Claude knows it should never guess how to pull the data. It uses that to pull the data. And if you're asking for something that those queries don't provide, it doesn't guess. It just tells you, I don't have that available. I can't pull that information.
And so we've done that. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say we've done that to protect the idea that from one day to the next, if you ask Claude, tell me about my open pipeline, you could get subtle variations every time, even not even every day, 2 minutes apart. You could, in the same chat, you could ask it the same question twice and you could get two different results. And when it comes to numbers and pulling data in that regard, there's no room for that kind of problem. Those subtle differences are okay if you're doing a call prep and you're pulling information at that sort of level, at that sort of zoom out. But when we're talking about hard numbers, you can't allow for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a really big difference between like prepping a board deck and prepping for a sales call where you were on the call 3 days ago, you remember most of it, you're filling in some gaps in your memory, and, you know, the AI is telling you, like, here's all the information you need to know. And then if you're doubting something, you're like, let me go check that. Let me check that report. Let me go double check this, that, and the other. I mean, that's something I've been doing with Sarah for years, is like provide all the hyperlinks so that I can like reference like the key, like the original source. But it's also interesting. I'm excited to like get more time to experiment with the MCP to see like if and to what extent it hallucinates. I asked Claude today as I was prepping for this podcast, like how like risky is it for the MCP to hallucinate? It basically says there's zero hallucination risk because you're pulling the raw data itself. If you ask, show me all open opportunities, Claude calls the Salesforce API, gets the actual records and reports them. The opportunity names, amounts, stages, close dates, those come directly from Salesforce. Cloud cannot hallucinate what Salesforce returns. However, what it says is the low but non-zero hallucination risk is synthesis, calculation, and interpretation. For example, aggregations. What's the total value of my open pipeline? Claude might miscalculate if there are many records and it's doing math in context rather than using a dedicated query. Filtering logic. If you say, show me stale deals, Cloud interprets stale and applies its own judgment of what that means. Truncated results.
Even the concept of open, the concept of open doesn't mean the same for everybody. Yeah, there is a mechanical way that that's done, standard, but we know that our terminology of open is not the same as what is documented, let's say, within Salesforce.
Yeah. And like, tell me if I'm wrong here, but my thought on this is like, you're not going to get like what you see on these LinkedIn posts of like, we built this over the weekend and like, we just replaced our entire XYZ team. That's an MVP and it's going to be far, far from perfect. Right. And so my thought is if you tap into the MCP and you start spitting out all these reports, it's probably going to be pretty wrong. There's going to be all these issues, and so be it. That's fine. And then you update the context and the instructions until you get it right. You double check your stuff, and you keep running it again and again and again until it's good enough. And then depending on the use case, you train your team to validate the things that are important to validate.
That's right. It's a highly capable, highly intelligent, but very green to your business employee that can work faster than any human can. So, but know that if you're providing feedback and you're providing coaching and instruction right, it's going to remember that. It's not going to forget the next time. As long as you provide clear instructions, it's going to remember, oh yeah, open means stage 2 or greater. So there's a lot of strength in that. But you have to remember that it's not that it's a toddler necessarily. It's just that it needs to understand things. It can't interpret what's living in your head.
Cool. Well, where do we go from here, Gerry? So I typically ask our guests, where can they find you? So Gerry, where can people find you?
So I live in southeastern Vermont. You can email me, Gerry@unionsquareconsulting.com. I'm on Slack. I don't have as much of a presence on LinkedIn as I probably should in other places, but we'll work to improve that. But
cool. I wanted to let you answer that, but I was like kind of just queuing it up for myself. Like if anybody's listening to this and you guys want some help with this stuff, we are not going to say that like we know everything there is to know about AI. And I don't think anybody else does. I think we're all learning this together. And I think the really important point here is like, if you want to build something over a weekend, like don't call me, please. Like we're not going to do that. Like we try not to work weekends. But if you want to build something and iterate on it continuously over a sustained period of time, to get it to a point where you can have your sales rep spending more time in front of customers and prospects instead of spending time updating Salesforce or prepping for calls. If you want to improve the way that marketing is targeting your audience and probably generate more meaningful opportunities with the right companies, if you want to improve the way that CS is looking at expansion opportunities, prepare for board meetings better, have better visibility, better forecasting, and you want to use AI and specifically the MCP with Salesforce to do that, reach out to us, and Gerry and our team will work with you, like I said, over that extended period of time to not only build that MVP over a weekend or preferably over a Monday to Wednesday, but then to iterate on it until we get it right for you. And then to continue to iterate on it as your business continues to evolve, as the tools evolve, as the data evolves, and as the ability to get more and more out of that stack evolves. So if you guys want to help, reach out to us. And if not, check out our content on unionscoreconsulting.com or our podcast, Go-to-Market Science, which you're listening to right now, unless you happen to be watching this on YouTube. Run with this. This is exciting. Like, people can build some really cool stuff with this, and I'm excited about it. And if you guys want to build that alongside us, we'd love to help. Anything to add to that, Gerry?
No, I just want to say you've done a fantastic job of keeping me on point. If anybody wants to get really in the weeds and way more technical, I'm your guy for that as well. So we tried to keep this relevant and high level, but there's whole more set of layers of technical side of this that I'm happy to talk shop about.
Cool, man. Thanks, Gerry.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the episode. If this resonated, please give us a 5-star rating and a follow. It helps us reach more people, and you get our latest and greatest content without having to search for it. And if you're looking for hands-on help in go-to-market strategy and/or RevOps, please reach out to us. We help our clients with everything from annual planning to improving processes in go-to-market, implementing systems to support those processes, and go-to-market AI. We're always happy to offer a free consultation to help you identify the best opportunities to improve your go-to-market engine with or without our help. You can find us at unionscoreconsulting.com, and the info will be in our show notes.